Hey, what's up, Unbroken Nation? I was leveraging my beliefs as my identity. And it wasn't until I realized that the brain is plastic and malleable that I was able to not only navigate that, but almost to this point, completely erase those ideals from myself. What is it that's happening in our developmental years where we hear things like that and we latch onto them so tightly that 45 years down the road, nothing's different?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? I mean, there is a time when the first drafts of our autobiography are being written, and so there's a particularly important time in our lives when we're trying to make meaning of who we are in the world, where when the brain is trying to stitch together a story, and really the self. Let's talk about the self a little bit before we get deeper into this. Maybe it'll help we break it down into its parts because there are different parts to the self that have different biological bases. So, one aspect of the self is the self in the here and now. And the brain has a representation of our bodies in space and the external parts of our bodies, the internal parts of our body. And a lot of the self we think is rooted in the brain's systems for keeping track of what's happening inside of our body. We have this feeling of being alive that just comes from homeostasis is the word in biology we use to refer to what life does to keep everything within the parameters it needs to maintain life. If things get too hot or too cold, we're going to die. If our heart's beating too fast or too slow, the brain has to control and regulate all of these basic life processes. And so we have our bodies, and some of our self is related to just that feeling of being a body in space. But we also have a self that extends across time. This idea of ourself as a person, as a character in a story that has certain qualities and certain goals and certain ideas. And when we ask people to think about those things, and we look at what's happening in the brain, there are certain brain networks that seem particularly important for thinking about oneself in this extended way, about who you are as a person over time. The interesting thing about those brain networks is that they are the same brain networks that are involved when people read stories or watch movies or think about stories. They're brain networks that seem to be involved in narrative comprehension. That understanding the world through stories is one of the ways that the brain makes sense of things, one of the fundamental ways in which the brain makes sense of things, and certainly one of the fundamental ways in which we make sense of ourselves. And so we have this story that the brain is stitching together events and characters and ideas. We're one of the characters in there, to make meaning out of what's happening. And so that there's this self that's an autobiography. And as you say, there's a time in life when that story is first being written that seems to have a lasting effect on us, that those first drafts of the story can become indelible and difficult to change.